Hi everyone, welcome to the Creative Convos under Catholic Author. Every month we try to bring together some different people with different outlooks to help inspire our insights around the genre of the month. And this month we are talking about fantasy, so welcome to Hannah, Katy, and Citlalin. Good to have you with us. So Creative Convos, it's all about, it's kind of riffing on our podcast where we'll take a theme and then try to unpack it. And part of the way that we're doing that is, you know, how do we maybe as, fiction writers who love our faith, how do we think about these genres and maybe how can we start to have a peek under the hood? And that's kind of a big thing for writers. Half the time you're focused on writing. Actually, I should say a third of the time you're focused on actually writing. A third of the time you're just kind of ruminating and doing the dishes and living life and thinking about writing. And the last third you're learning about how to actually do the craft of writing. And if there's another part, let me know. But that's kind of how I break it down. That's basically how I live my life. So it's really important then to sort of have a look under the hood at, and think constructively about what goes into a genre, why it works, why it exists, so that we know how to blend it with other genres. Usually anything you write is going to be a mixture of two things. So it's good to get a good sense, I think, of that overall. So Catholic Author, the actual show, and then these Creative Convos, it's about fiction for modern Catholic authors. We're talking creed, craft, and co-creation. Sometimes we've got dragons involved. It's usually all about grit, grace, and gods. I'm your host. So again, Dominic, founder of Catholic Author. We're here to inspire your faith and your fiction. Let's go around the room real quick. We have a new guest today. Hannah, Citlalin, and Katy are returning wonderkins from the podcast and also from previous interviews. Why don't we go around? Katy, would you like to kick us off? What's your 1-minute bio and your interest?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a Catholic fantasy author and humorist. I write a lot of stories that are both parodies of fairy tales while also being fairy tales themselves. And right now I have 2 books out. One is Love, Treachery, and Other Terrors, and one is The Canadian Nights, a take on the Arabian Nights. So that's what I've been working on, and a lot of short stories up on my blog as well.
That is awesome. Citlalin, how about you?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm also a fantasy author. I'm heavily inspired by my Mexican heritage, Legend of Zelda, and Korean dramas and Japanese anime. So yeah, I just love fantasy, so I'm super excited for today's talk.
That is awesome. Hannah, welcome for joining us for the first time. What's your origin story?
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Yeah, I'm Hannah Alcorn, and I'm studying education in English at Benedictine College right now. I'm currently the president of our English club and a member of our writing group, and I'm a budding author myself. I love fantasy. I love reading fantasy, especially. Right now, I'm kind of on a Tolkien kick, but I don't know, when is anyone not on a Tolkien kick if you're Catholic and love fantasy? So yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
That's awesome. In a bit, we can start to unpack an initial thought that I put forward for maybe how Catholics can understand fantasy. I know that it's kind of a heady title, so we'll unpack it in a minute. The way that I'm putting it, the way that I like to think about it, as fantasy is an imaginative and archetypal frontier with the supernatural. And I'd like to be proven wrong, or if that's insufficient. So that's kind of what today's show is all about. So why don't we actually start with some of our favorite novels and stories, especially as it relates to fantasy, maybe something you read in the last year that really jumped out at you, or something that you grew up reading and you just really love. It can be a movie, Katy, would you like to kick us off? What are some of your favorite, fantasy pieces of work?
I'm just gonna sound like a broken record here and say Chronicles of Narnia, because they are my favorite fantasy books. Those and The Hobbit. I've read Lord of the Rings. It's great. I feel like I'm not quite smart enough for Lord of the Rings, though. So definitely more of a Hobbit Narnia type fan. I love the Harry Potter books. Yeah, I mean, there's so much. I could go on and on and on, but I'd say that those would be like the 3 main the 3 main series that I think of.
Very cool. Citlalin, how about you?
Yeah, I'm also going to sound like a broken record. I mean, Legend of Zelda is what got me into fantasy. It's what most inspires me. So that's a video game series. And but if we talking about books, in the last year, the Queens of Renthia, the first book, The Queen of Blood by Sarah Beth Durst. It's an adult fantasy. That got me out of a huge reading slump, and I describe it as like a fresh take on like a magical world and a magic system with like spirits, and girls having to deal with all these like kind of like not hungry, like malicious spirits, but they have to work together. Anyway, it's pretty cool. And also Crimson Bound by Rosamund Hodge. She's a Catholic herself, and her story really resonated with me. Her main character is not like the nicest person, but I just love like reluctant heroes and like characters that make mistakes and learn from that. So yeah, highly recommend those ones.
Very cool. Hannah, what's your take?
Yeah, again, I gotta say The Hobbit. I grew up, my dad like read that to me when I was little, and it's just like stuck with me for so long. And I love it. And recently, this is a little bit more sci-fi, but I think we can still classify it as fantastical. C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet was really cool. I'm trying to finish that whole trilogy, haven't yet, sorry. But that was really exciting and yeah, fantastical to me, and just recently read, so I like that one a lot.
Mm-hmm. I think that the sci-fi and fantasy are often lumped together, and in a way for a good reason. It's because they're technically the same sort of thing, but one is more like imaginative and about the archetypes, and the other is more materialist and about Western modern culture dealing with that same frontier of the supernatural. So you're right, reading that. That's one I reread in the last 3 years as well, and it does read like a fantasy novel, and I think it's meant to be. And I think so. Offering my own, definitely Tolkien and Lewis. I grew up reading those. Lloyd, I think it's Lloyd Alexander who wrote the Chronicles of Prydain.
Oh yeah.
I loved and reread that a ton of times. The what's his name? Taran, the assistant pig keeper. As an adult, there's a phenomenal trilogy I read called, I can remember the first book, The Curse of Chalion, and I remember getting to the end of that and thinking, if Saint Teresa of Avila ever wrote a fantasy trilogy, she would write that. Okay, it was not only just like epic and really deep and with tons of reveals towards the end, but it was also an amazing sort of fantasy take on how we think about, maybe how Christians think about reality and the, spiritual material, wedding of things. I have no idea. What's her name? Lois McMaster Bujold is the author. I have no idea of her background. But another author that I've really grown to like, and I've not read nearly enough of his stuff, but I've read a couple of books. Each book is like a tome. Brandon Sanderson, right? His Way of Kings series, and I love how he thinks about magic, and he's incredibly well constructed, and everything is in a big cosmere, I think he calls it. So yeah, there's a lot of just really cool, stuff out there. I'd like to go around again and ask, what is it about those novels? And Citlalin, you kind of hinted at that already. What is it about those novels that really, that you love about them as fantasy? Katie, can I throw you on the spot again?
Yeah. So I love.
And could I ask you to just lean forward a little bit? The mic seems a bit far away.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So, I just absolutely love the way that fantasy allows us to explore deep spiritual truths in a fantastical world. So for example, you could use like fairies to represent like demons, right? If you wanted to, or you could use some monster to represent that, or you could use like you could use something to represent kind of like angels. But they don't have to be. It doesn't have to be one-to-one realistic, right? They don't have to be a one-to-one analogy per se. So you have some freedom to sort of use your imagination and to contemplate spiritual realities in kind of a safe zone, like a safe world that you've created in your own mind. And I think that that's the difference between, you know, really fantastic stories that just teach you some of the truths of human nature and of spirituality versus kind of some of the fantasy that I don't like reading as much as just fantasy that doesn't really have God's grace written into it. You know, maybe there's a battle between, like, you know, elves and orcs or whatever, but God's grace is not really working in those characters and you don't see it. And I think that that's the difference between a fantastic fantasy story and a less than fantastic fantasy story.
Yeah, it's kind of like, and I'm not, what's the word? Probably showing my lack of understanding, but maybe Sword and Sandals fantasy, or that's not even a thing. That's a movie series. Like maybe Dungeons and Dragons kind of fantasy, or what's the word? I'm forgetting. Sword something. Anyhow, but it's like literally just, it's like a normal one story, but simply transposed into a fantasy context, and then it's just about telling a fun story that maybe doesn't really go anywhere, and that's kind of where it stays. I don't think there's anything wrong with, you know, telling those kinds of stories that purely for fun, just taking a load off, you know. But I think if we're taking our faith really, you know, wanting to take it just a little bit more seriously, then I kind of like what you're saying, Katie. What does that then prompt to start thinking a little bit deeper if we are wanting to communicate something? I'll just go for a second here before you sit, Citlalin. There's I had one idea for writing a fantasy novel, which ended up just ballooning into a whole thing. It came out of Lewis's Weight of Glory post from a long time ago. And then I remember reading that, like, what if a god was imprisoned? You know, kind of like, I don't know if anyone's watching Moon Knight right now. It's kind of coming out on Disney, and it's so much fun so far. Good. It is. My first experience with him, I've never actually read his comics, but he seems really cool. Again, there's a great example of, it just feels really fantasy, you know, magical realism. But you know, I thought, wouldn't it be fun or interesting? What if a god was accidentally released and everybody thought that this was the worst thing? It's like the equivalent of a nuclear bomb going off, you know, in this fantasy world, because we have unleashed a god. But then by the end, you find out that no, it was a good god that was captured. And the entire system that you've grown up in is the wrong system. And now you have to completely rethink everything, and the world is sort of remade, you know. It's kind of like when Persephone gets stuck underground with Hades for, you know, half a year, and now imagine you normalize winter, like in Narnia. Mm-hmm. But then you return Father Christmas, you return Persephone, spring returns, and then you have to remake your, you know, understanding of the world. So that's what fascinates me about fantasy, is the ability to take something that we love and or are interested in and just want to play with that, you know. Citlalin, do you want to have a go at you know, why maybe you like fantasy?
Yeah, that all really resonates with me. Like I mentioned, Crimson Bound by Rosamund Hodge. That one, again, it, like Katie says, that one, it's a fantasy that shows God's grace through the main character, her journey of redemption. Because this is not a spoiler. This happens like on the very first page. She kills her aunt to survive because of reasons, and the whole story is her journey, kind of accepting the darkness in her and learning to overcome that and ask for forgiveness and stuff like that. And so and like you said, Dominic, fantasy lets us explore, like, just questions that we have about life or dilemmas that we're facing and stuff like that. I write some fiction, like pro-life fiction or fantasies about like abortion or stuff, and it's because I want to show like compassion for anyone who's like been in the situation, but in like a fantastical setting, because that's what I'm most comfortable with and what I just enjoy reading. And I think that really opens up the door for people to kind of look at it in a different way, a different perspective. And I think it can open up conversation and stuff like that. So, I mean, yeah. And also, I mean, yeah, I really like fun stories. But, yeah, when they have like more heart to them, that definitely like has a longer lasting impact on me. Yeah.
Yeah. And you've gone on to write, all kinds of fun stories. And you and I have chatted briefly about just kind of fun, just sort of silly stuff. Like I sent you a message on Instagram about, what was it, like giant Canadian trolls ripping up maple trees and sucking on them like sugar cane.
Yeah.
I mean, like, why wouldn't you? It's a big, sweet tasting tree.
And then
where does that go in terms of having funny tales?
Yeah. And some of those can actually have a lot of heart to them too. So it doesn't always have to be like more like dark leaning. But yeah.
But exactly, and I think that's partly where I'm going to come back to this, sense of a frontier with the supernatural, because there's this space that we Catholics live in. It's a sacramental worldview, right? And no, that doesn't just mean baptisms and the sacraments. It means we don't live in the same universe that our atheist friends, non-Christian friends live in. We're closer in a way to the pagans of the ancient world, who see angels and elves inside every tree and around every corner, because we don't see a division between a spiritual reality floating somewhere like out there that maybe we'll get into, and a material reality that's here. We don't even really see a distinction between the idea of us having a soul and a body as two sort of separate things. We see them as the same thing. And in our culture where it is now, all of these things are divided and separated and so on. And so as a Catholic, or someone in faith, or someone who is trying to kind of get in touch with what reality is, like all of it, it's very deeply sacramental, meaning it's an outward sign of an inward grace. And that's what fantasy is awesome at, because everything can be, not always is, can be magical or spelled or enchanted, or be a portal, or just things that you look at can fraction off and sort of into spectrums of different kinds of beings, trying to sort of turn our heads sideways and look at it, at things from a slightly different way. So I think it's very much a frontier. It's trying to get us to, here's how we see the world. Yes, it's a dramatization. Yes, it's exaggerated for the fun of it. That's why you read fiction, is for fun. Yeah, I love that you mentioned that on fairy stories, because I read that so many times as an early teen, highlighting and underlining and just, so if you are, if you haven't yet read it, I'm sure you can find it online. Go ahead and Google that, Dear Catholic Author Listener, and check that out. It really is kind of a manifesto, it should be part of your mental toolkit, your soul toolkit for how to think about that. One of the points that I love about how Tolkien, approaches this is he talks about us as sub-creators. I think that there are some approaches in our faith where we talk about being co-creators with God in what happens with creation. God sets up this ongoing creative act where he sustains us, within his life. But then he kind of hands the reins over to us to then take the next steps, make the world better for each other, for ourselves, giving us that freedom to make our own choices, right? So that's that co-creation aspect with him. But then writers get to do something crazy cool where we get to subcreate. So it's like God thinks of the universe, and here we all are. We think of a universe after coffee and on a good day, and it comes to life in our minds, and it's real, and it just feels so real. And in doing that, in a way we get to, and this is something I've really grown to love, in a way we get to play God, in a way we get to mirror or image or imagine maybe like a tiny bit of what it's like to create something. And in doing so, in creating these characters and these people, we get to love our characters from the inside out. We run around loving everybody from the outside in, and then they do something wrong, they say something wrong, and they rub us the wrong way, and we can't stand them. Or they're under this label, and we can't stand them. But in a novel, especially one that we're creating, we see, especially the main characters, we see them from the inside out. And I think that is a really massive point, because that then means we can then put our characters through hell itself and know that we can trust that they're going to come out the other end because we are prepared to stick with them. I think when we take that kind of thing seriously, that is an opportunity for growth as a better human being for us as an author, to grow in compassion, which the more you practice, with your own characters, the more you then start to see that in other movies, maybe other books. It's like, oh, I know why they're going through this. And really what happened there was the story just ended too soon. But I could imagine how God is still working with that life, all those terrible things, And then I think we can then translate that into our own life, people around us, and maybe start to love as God loves, to love people from the inside out, And I think that's kind of why I say being a Catholic author can be a vocation that isn't going to let up when we love it and take it seriously, and it's going to prod us, and pull us, maybe become better people. Citlalin, I loved a little point you made about how we write because we don't have the answers, and that's actually echoing something that, what's her name, Flannery O'Connor said. She's like, don't write works of apologetics. That's not what fiction is for. Apologists, and evangelists write because they have answers and they want to share them. We write most of the time maybe because we don't have answers and we want to explore what is it like to live through the question. I still haven't totally understood that, and but it makes too much sense. I keep wanting to sit with that. Any thoughts from anybody before we continue?
Yeah, I think not just writers, but in the end, readers also learn to sympathize or empathize with through the characters that we write. That's it. I think that's cool too, that it transfers to the reader also.
Mm-hmm. Very cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so kind of circling back to the theme of today's chat, the imaginative and archetypal frontier with the supernatural. We've already started kind of talking around that. One of the reasons why I love stuff like Star Trek and Narnia and Star Wars. We don't have to talk about the latest trilogy or its reboot, but what I love about so much fantasy is it is a frontier. And the older I get, the more I realize my love of fiction and so on is very much frontier based. It's the turning the corner, the discovering of new lands, the discovering of new places, and it's that sense of discovery. Kind of like Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke. And I know that's a sci-fi thing, but it's that sense of we have never seen this, we've never explored this, and we have no idea what discovering this is going to do to us and to our understanding of things. So I'm curious, though, to ask what you all think about the use of the phrase archetypal. And I know Hannah and Katie, you've both been through college and so on. Citlalin, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Jung, and I'm only nominally been reading him. If you were to define an archetype, Hannah and or Katie, what would you say?
I'm thinking a little bit about, because I have read a little bit about that, but I'm not sure I have a fully fleshed out thoughts on that particular topic. I feel like I use archetypes sometimes, but generally speaking, I usually make my characters based on some combination of my own experience or experiences with people I know, so they don't necessarily fit neatly into the archetype box of this, the rogue, for example. I might write a rogue, but I wouldn't want it to just be a rogue. I think even your comic relief has to be more than just the comic relief. Your villain has to be more than just a villain. Your hero has to be more than just a hero. I mean, obviously I say this with a grain of salt. It depends on the story, right? I don't think even all cliches are bad, or all stereotypes or all archetypes are bad to use within your story, because they play with the reader's expectations, and then you can play with the reader's expectations. But I also just tend to like to make my characters a little bit deeper than what we'd have with just the archetype of the strong hero or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's fair. It looks like we may have lost Hannah, so maybe she'll come back in a minute. But
yeah.
The reason why why I threw in the word archetype is because, especially thinking about Lord of the Rings and almost every other sort of story. When I was recently taking a dip into Carl Jung's, it was recently published, The Red Book, something he wrote, where his basically his dream journal. And I'm reading through it and I'm realizing, wow, all of this sounds like I'm reading a fantasy novel. It sounds like I'm reading fairy tales and so on, because almost all of the tropes and themes and devices that are used in fairy tales, not a fantasy, they come from a lot of the things that we dream about: forests and oceans and strange parents and, you know, weird things that happen and so on. We take a lot of those and we turn them into stories because we can then all, you know, relate to them. They all might mean slightly different things. But you'll notice, or I've noticed, in going over, you know, all kinds of different stories, you can almost always track general themes of humanity to the characters. And it looks like Hannah has now jumped back in. So welcome back, Hannah. What I was just saying was defining an archetype is general themes of humanity. And I think that either Jung or, you know, older than him, or even us today, I think they got it down to like maybe 12, and then it can sort of split into others. But a lot of them, you'll have like the magician type, got the ruler, you'll have the ordinary person, you'll have the rebel, the rogue, or the jester, like Katie said. These big themes of humanity, almost all of us fit into them, you know, or we sort of participate in them, right? So I'm very much the kind of the magician sort of style, or the sage. Like, I love to learn stuff, and then I love to share that, right? And sometimes when we can understand our character in light of, you know, that theme of the archetype, one, it makes it a whole lot easier to understand how to be consistent with the character, and then where to start pushing that, to start making them a little bit more real. More often than not, I find, almost every time I'll go to write a story, if I'm not like actually aware of what I'm doing, I'm basically writing me as the main character. And I think this is what I would probably want to say. This is my wish fulfillment of how I would want to go through something. One reason why I cringe looking back at my first novel, it's like total wish fulfillment, and that has its place, but it's not actually in a way honoring or doing good service to the actual character itself. So trying to come back to that sense of, you know, why did I use the word archetype? I think that there are great themes of how it means to be human that both men and women tap into, you know, and then all over the world. And we resonate with that. That's why there's the archetype, for example, of Batman, the kind of broody, Loki sort of character. And then you've got your Thor, Superman, you know, god of light and energy kind of, and an uplifting, you know, theme, right? And there's different kinds of people who really gravitate towards that. You know, I love being the kind of Zorro Batman guy growing up, because I just love that broody, moody stuff, you know. Hannah, any thoughts from you on all of that?
Yeah, the archetype, I think, is interesting to explore. And I will say that I don't think I have the best grasp of it either. But
Sure.
I think it's dangerous to be too constrained, but recognizing that there are trends in humanity and being able to tap into those is really beneficial in general, I believe.
And I think that's basically it. It's like we're taking a look under the hood. And most readers, most people don't, because there's just life happening all the time. But that's kind of our job, is to look under the hood and what are the general things that are happening, and then look a little deeper, like, why does that happen? So there's usually certain kinds of people who are drawn to certain kinds of stories, and that's why we have genres. That's why we have, you know, labels on things. And it's really important to understand that. So understand the genres, but then also understand certain kinds of people and different stages of life, and then write for those stages, write for those themes. I think it'll make a lot of things easier. And then that's kind of where our job comes in, being that little more creative. Now that we kind of got the building blocks, what is my unique way kind of working with that? Katie, you look like you got something.
I had a question.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Anna.
I just had a question, because this is something that I've been mulling on, and I feel like Katie and everyone here could give good insight onto this. On the topic of creativity, Tolkien is very adamant against just the use of plain allegory, right? And he kind of jabs at Lewis for this, right? In the obvious allegorical quality of, Narnia. And I've just been contemplating what I think about that and the nature of allegory and fantasy and how effective it is. And since Katie, you seem to be an avid Lewis fan, I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I'm going to answer like a lawyer and say it depends. I think that so what I will say is I think Tolkien's rule like generally I'd say for most people that applies, because I've seen a lot of really bad allegory that makes things really preachy, like especially in like sci-fi where you're like I don't know, that's whatever political topic of the day it is, and you're like, okay, well obviously I know what this is really about. This is about I don't know, immigration or whatever it is, and then people see it and then they know exactly what your take on it is, and then it becomes more of just like a opinion piece as opposed to like an actual story. That said, I think C.S. Lewis just does it really, really well, so I don't have any complaints about him doing it. I'd say if you're starting out, if it's your first time, try to avoid that, because I've seen a ton of like allegories about like social justice in novels that are coming out recently, and I can tell that it's something that's very prevalent. It's on a lot of people's mind, and definitely something that we should be talking about. But it gets to the point where I pick up a novel and I'm like, okay, another person where the elves are the oppressed people, and like the dwarves are the oppressors, and I'm like, okay, I've seen this like 50 million times and I know what you're saying. let's handle this in like a new way. So yeah, that's my take. That would be my take on it. Just be careful you don't get preachy about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think a really good example of a story that kind of straddles both lines is actually The Wizard of Oz. Because we've grown to love that. We've just grown up with that, and it's just a great story on its own merits. But then you sort of dig into the actual origins of the story, and you realize it was an almost on the nose at its time parable for what was going on with the First World War and the gold standard and the three who brought about the agreement against Germany and so on. Cowardly Lion being like England, I think. And then you can sort of look at that and go, oh well, okay, I could see all of that and how all of that, where that takes the story, but at the same time the story still stands. It's still a good story on its own merits. And even if you didn't know any of the allegory, does it still make sense? So yeah, definitely with Katie on that about, we don't ever want to be pushy or preachy, because that's not the role of a good story. But you can still have some pretty overt allegorical, almost one-for-one stuff. Maybe it's just a matter of like how much, because there comes a point where it becomes like there's too many one-for-one notices. Like if you're trying to tell an epic kind of fantasy story, at some point you're going to try to copy the Christ moment and sacrifice. You want some big heroic something like the new Wheel of Time movie series, and he gets to the end, it's like, oh, here we go. It's kind of an original take, or it's a different take on the Christ sacrifice. So yes, in a way, it's kind of a one-for-one thing, but the story builds up around it to kind of, be its own thing.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, Dominic. Is that are you able to watch the story with its own merits? Because the other thing about it is it makes it timeless. I think if you've got an allegory, like you were saying about the Wizard of Oz, like I had no idea that it was a direct allegory of anything. I just thought it was a fun story because all of that stuff was probably pretty obvious to people during that time period. But now, you know what? It's still a fun story about a girl and a lion and a tin man, and who cares? So that's it. Can it stand alone, or does it just completely not make sense unless you know what it's an allegory for?
Yeah. So cool. All right, moving on then with why don't we talk about toxic tropes with fantasy, and we've kind of already started doing that. So Katie, you're always awesome at identifying these. Can I put you on the spot? What is one toxic trope when it comes to fantasy that we need to start being aware of?
Okay, I'm gonna take this question, and the very first thing I'm gonna do is touch on the last thing you say and mention a non-toxic trope, because there are some very positive tropes in fantasy that we should be aware of. So one of those would be the self-sacrifice, right? I think, we see a ton of cliches where the hero dies and they come back to life in an imitation of, right, Jesus' sacrifice, death, and resurrection. And I think that that's fantastic. Like, I could read that over and over again, assuming it's done well. I've also seen a lot of it where it seems, like, super contrived, or I'm like, he didn't need to sacrifice himself. I can think of 15 other ways he could have gotten out of that situation, right? But there's definitely ways to do it well, and to do it not so well. So that's what I would say. It's like, tropes are not always the enemy, and they're not always toxic. That being said, there are a lot of toxic tropes. For fantasy, let's see. Sexy elves. Can we just... Can we just not? Can we please stop with that? Every single secular fantasy book I see, I'm like... No. I've had enough of that. A lot of secular tend to be just really gory, like to the point where it's like gratuitous. You just have people
channeling their inner HBO.
Yeah. Oh yeah, HBO or this type of stuff. Oh, I hate this so much. See, now Dominic, you got me started. I hate this. Okay, this one. This is the worst trope ever. Okay, the woman is oppressed, right? She's being like objectified or raped or something like that, and the filmmakers are like, oh, it's so terrible that she's getting raped, so let's like show it in full graphic detail from 15 different angles. Oh, it's so horrible, they're objectifying this woman, let's show her in an iron bikini. I'm like, good freaking job, filmmakers. You are standing up for the dignity of women. Okay, I'm just going to stop now, because otherwise I'm just going to take over the rest of this podcast. Somebody else go.
So maybe I should instead ask, does anybody have a bugbear about how it's, often done, and then also something maybe we admire? Citlalin, anything come to mind?
Yeah, so I don't think I've actually read this in any of the stories so far, but I have heard of it. It's the, and I don't really know if it's toxic, just kind of annoying for me personally. When I hear about it, when a newbie suddenly like gains like total strength or something, like without ever practicing, and it's just like, I mean, so I wouldn't really mind it if it actually kind of caused some sort of conflict, like it kind of bolstered their pride, and that like led to something. Like I said, some conflict that they have to resolve, and they have to be humbled or something. That'd be kind of maybe interesting. But like if it's just like they don't know anything before, and then suddenly they just get like superpowers, and it's like, yeah, I'm like the strongest person alive without any work, and I'm just like, oh, okay, like that's kind of boring. Like I just kind of like training montages and like seeing my characters sweat and cry to become the ultimate. Like I really love underdog stories, so. Like, whenever I do, like, hear about that stuff, I'm pretty sure I actually have seen it, if I just can't remember. I probably, like, blocked it out of my mind. But, like, it's the complete opposite of what I like. So it's just like, no, that's not really for me. But I mean, like, underdog stories, I feel like that's the other opposite that I do like. And I feel like I have seen that in fantasy quite a bit. Like I said, the Queens of Renthia and Queen of Blood, the main character, she's a total underdog. Like she's the weakest in her class, and she struggles with it like throughout the whole series. And I really love that, because like that's so realistic. Like you need people's help. You need to get better all the time, and then I like it when people underestimate them, and they do work so hard that they actually surprise people. And, they become the hero, or just help out when it's needed, even just a little bit. So, yeah, underdog stories, those are good ones.
Yeah, I was thinking, I love this, contemplating this, but I'm not sure how I feel about the chosen one trope. Because I think sometimes I can enjoy it, but sometimes I feel like it's just so overused that it's the same way with like, oh, this newbie all of a sudden has all these powers. It's kind of like, okay, this one kid is responsible for the fate of the entire universe all of a sudden when he's 14. And I was thinking about Harry Potter specifically because Harry is the chosen one right from the beginning, but then it's Neville at the end who ends up being the chosen one actually. It's not, I don't even know if it's an underdog story because he doesn't have too much time in the limelight, but it's almost like Harry is the chosen one. He goes all the way. You know, you've got 7 books of Harry, and then right at the last minute, it's like, nope, he's not the one who ends the fight. And that was really intriguing to me. So I wondered what you guys thought about that type of chosen one trope, and also what Rowling does with it.
Katie, you want to field that?
Yeah.
You look like you're itching to.
That's because I have like a really personal story about specifically what you're talking about with Harry Potter. Is that like when I was a teen, like I went through this period, probably like all teens do, where I was just like really, really lonely. Just, you know, didn't feel like I could connect with anyone. You know, I had friends, but not like being able to connect with them. And I remember, you know, I'd talked to my spiritual director a little bit about this, and he said, you know, well, the devil wants you to feel like you're alone. And then right after that, I went to see one of the Harry Potter movies. I forget which one it was. I think it was number 5. And there's this scene where Harry Potter is getting like withdrawn from his friends, and he meets Luna on the shore of this lake. And she said, well, if I was you know who, I'd want you to feel alone. Because when it's just you alone, you're not as much of a threat. And I just like started like crying like right there in the theater. Wow. So it was just like this really powerful moment, and I think that that's kind of the point of the Harry Potter series, why it does that trope so much better than so many other series, is because even though he's technically the chosen one, he can't do anything without all of the strong characters around him. And you've got, you know, you got his professors, like his parents are really positive, and they're like with him spiritually throughout the entire series, even though that they died. And you've got the Weasley parents are with him, so he's got like all these people around him, and so it's a victory that that happens together instead of just him saving the day all by himself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that I mean, obviously, there's a couple of reasons why we write chosen one stories. You know, maybe we're trying to tell our own version of a Christ story. You know. But I think especially when we're younger and we're writing stuff, we write a chosen one story because it's a wish fulfillment thing. It's like, I would love for my life to go, or I would love to go through this. Now, I can say this because I did that and I wrote the novel and I self-published it. And so I want to sort of start with, it can be a good thing. The downsides, though, is when they're granted some kind of superpower, because you kind of want to speed up the learning curve, you know, and they don't actually have to earn, you know, sort of chosen one status. They're just kind of like Samson. You're like just handed this power on a plate. But then there's kind of a catch, you know. So, and that's why the Samson story works. You know, there's the Harry story, like, I don't know what I'm getting into, and everybody's venerating me, and this is just getting worse and worse. And so he has to actually work, you know, to earn it. Throw my story on the fire here with the Ring of Fantasy. I introduced 2 characters, the boy and the girl, and then the boy didn't really have to do anything to kind of earn being the hero, the kind of chosen one. You know, I even made both characters chosen ones, but the boy just goes around, gathers up all the weapons, and as soon as you touch the weapons, it automatically makes you a better warrior, and he can defeat anything. And by the end, there's like, technically there's no real struggle. And so here's where what I want to contribute is, when you have a story and maybe it has maybe it's just got a central main character or something, or you know, maybe there's only a couple of characters. The trope that I can't stand is when all of the attention goes on the one character, and then a very important seeming secondary character is introduced that goes nowhere. Or if it's the girl, she's purely meant to be saved. You know, it's just kind of like
Amen.
guy, you know, a trophy, right? It's kind of a trophy character, maybe is what I should say. And that's what I did with my character. Now, you know, I can look back at myself and be like, oh, I wanted to feel better about myself. I wanted to be noticed as a kid. I wanted to be noticed. I wanted to do dramatic things. I wanted to rescue somebody I cared about. And I wanted to do it, again, at a frontier and discover something cool and discover something about myself in the process. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with that. But it's when you're entering into it unconsciously, then I think it can be a problem. Because, well, you're not being conscious. And that's actually something you need to be doing when you're telling a story, is as conscious as possible, entering into this fictive dream. So that point there about the whole trophy girl aspect, you know, that's a trope I just utterly can't stand, because it doesn't honor, you know, the role of women. So that's something I'd encourage everyone to think hard about when you're creating your characters. You don't have to give girls big ass swords and, you know, make them into altar guys, because that doesn't honor the contribution the guys need to bring to the story, or what the girls need to bring to the story. So actually think about your character, and if it actually does make sense, you know, or if it's just kind of like lazy writing and you're just like, yeah, this would be cool, let's just keep going. So starting to wrap up our time together, and thanks again for everyone for coming on. If you had a recommendation from something you've really enjoyed, maybe from the last fantasy story you've read or written, what would be a piece of encouragement you'd like to share about writing a fantasy story? Katie, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I'll say this just because it's on my mind, because you just talked about male and female archetypes. And I'll also say this, you know, you touched a little bit there on the strong female character, which I could just do an entire podcast about how to do that well and terribly. But what I would say, because I have, a lot of men will come up to me and ask, like, how do I write women? Like, there's this, like, big mystery to it. And I say, and what I would say to them is, if you're writing a character of the opposite sex, you know, men and women are different, but we're more similar than we are different. So my big piece of advice was, when in doubt, don't ask what a woman would do, ask what you would do. That would be my advice. Don't ask what are the female archetypes or what are the male archetypes. Ask what are the archetypes. It's not going to work in every single case, as you said, but as a general rule to fall back on, that is what I would recommend that you do.
I think that's a great piece of advice, because I remember reading someone a long time ago saying the same basic thing. It's like, when you're creating your character, for a minute, just take the gender away. Mm-hmm. What is that person interested? What do they want? And then what else does adding the gender back in add to that? Because there are some brilliantly, strong women who are still very feminine and just can outcompete men. And there are some extremely sensitive and more feminine men who are just phenomenal human beings. And then you've got just very, very manly men and very feminine women. So that's why it is a spectrum. So again, being conscious of who the character is, and not just like, oh yeah, long hair, that automatically defines, their values for the story. Citlalin, any takeaways or recommendations?
Yeah, my thing is always like experiment and to try to branch out of like the norm. Like, I would love to see more non-human races in fantasy, like creatures, monsters, like a mix, like based off of like, natural elements or just anything cool, or like animals, and also experimenting with like your world building, maybe try and create some like fusion settings, or expand like the time, where is it, like the era that like you base your story off of. Different cultures and stuff like that. Like, I would just love to see more diversity in the world building specifically. So, and characters, like character creations.
And I think just to riff on that for a second, there's a reason why we often start with humans It's like when you're telling Star Trek, you start with humans and then they go meet weird stuff or beautiful stuff, whatever. It's because you want to start with a relatable starting point. So there's a reason why we do that. But I like your point about actually being more creative. Like if you're a tree beard, then what you then need to highlight relatable, humanly relatable points, like, the inner life or how decisions are made. But then this is where the whole point of fantasy is, if I was different or had this extra thing, or I could sprout a lobster shell whenever I wanted, what would that then change about how I live life? And then actually being creative and coming up with 3 weird, cool things, or having friends help you, bounce that around. And that's why joining a creative writing community can really change your game by getting lots of different feedback points. But then do the work of actually coming up with, here's 3 cool things that would happen if I was not completely human. I mean, this is why we love superhero stories or any fantasy stories. Like, oh yes, if I had that power, I didn't think of that. I would do that too. Hannah, any takeaways?
Yeah, I guess this is kind of a slightly different vein, but I just encourage everyone to explore the spiritual in fantasy, because I think as Christians and as Catholics, we have this privilege of almost living in a fantastical world where the spiritual is real, and spiritual battle is real. And I think being able to embrace that is very unique in fantasy, especially when we come from a tradition that sees it in our real world and can reflect that in fantastical ways.
And I think
that's really cool.
I think that's a fantastic place to wrap there. And if you haven't actually yet read it, check out St. Teresa of Avila's book on the interior castle, or St. John of the Cross on the Dark Night of the Soul. Both are, they're gripping and they're serious and a little bit wordy, but they're also very imaginative journeys into our inner life and what that's like. And most of the time, if you're telling a fantasy story, you're probably going to be writing, characters who are in the first part of both of these books. If you don't actually finish them, you probably should. Even just skim read them to get a sense of where it goes. But your characters are probably going to be on the first part of that journey. To think about St. Teresa of Avila's interior castle, she imagines it as like a maze or a mansion, and you're slowly progressing through rooms, to get into the center, which is where Christ is constantly calling and pulling you. But you end up returning to multiple rooms throughout your journey, and getting into the first 3 rooms can be a really big challenge, because it can feel really hard and really impossible and so on, and you end up backing out, and then you lose progress and so on. But then you start that journey again, and then it gets easier, and then you start pushing through new layers that you didn't know were there, and you can read that and think like, whoa, I could actually just copy, paste, put my characters through some of this, And this is the fun part, where you, as the writer, actually then start living through this in an imaginative way with your characters. There's a great little sort of point about psychology, I think, where it's like you become that which you pretend to be, right? So if I'm going to pretend to be a really good dad, let me pretend to do that for 1 week. After about a week, I will have basically rewired neural pathways, and you've created a habit, basically. I really, really think if you take character building seriously, you really put them through stuff, and you're it's active contemplation, like what the Jesuits would have you do. It's like take a scripture passage and really imagine it, live it. Well, this is what we writers are doing all the time. And if we're working hard with characters to help them grow, that's also going to have an impact on us, And that's why being a Catholic author can be a really inspiring vocation. So, hey, if you enjoyed this chat, thank you for watching. Please hit like. It helps more people to learn more about us and meet these awesome guests. Thanks again, Citlalin, Katy, and Hannah. It was wonderful to have you with us. Looking forward to having you back in the future. For those who haven't yet checked out Catholic Author, please do. It's a creative online community to help you build your writing network, meet other people, give and get feedback, share your works in progress. Plus, we've got tons of cool stuff like shows like this and awesome people on our podcast coming back all the time. Thanks again. Come check us out at catholicauthor.us. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, keep writing.